Good afternoon, all. So, new Lunch and Learn. I wanted to try and do a presentation a little less standard. Everybody else here has wonderful talks on new tools we can use or ways to utilize things, but I'm not a coder. So I was going to take a totally different approach and start talking about that topic nobody wants to talk about, which is ethics in the tech industry. It is probably the most hot button topic right now as far as everybody talking about tech is concerned. Especially now as we're watching things blow up between Facebook, between Google, between the possibility of Russian involvement in elections and data gathering among the US population. So I thought it was a good time to kind of broach this topic, as it's a conversation that really everybody in every aspect of the tech field should be kind of having at this point. The main problem is that both inside and out, people are concerned that potentially technology and technologists lack an ethical standard. And legislation isn't really effective or efficient to treat this. It has to be a conversation that's held between consumers, between developers, between designers. And so the question is, why is it difficult? Why is it hard? How can we apply it, if we can apply it? And why bother with ethics in the first place? So to do wrong right, or the questions of ethics in technology is the topic. I'm going to start off with the general problem. I'm going to show examples of where we have most recently failed as far as applying ethics, and why it's hard, but a lack of ethics can be bad. Most, as all of you are aware, as all of you follow the news, a company called Cambridge Analytica, or a company that was called Cambridge Analytica, dun dun dun, came under fire because they had utilized a Facebook survey as well as other data gathering tools to harvest the opinions, habits, and data of what was eventually estimated to be about 87 million users of Facebook. Cambridge Analytica was connected to the Trump campaign, which made this a very popular topic in the media, and they were also connected to a Russian company called Lukoil, a Russia-based company in a large number of Eastern blocs that also deals with Western data and information gathering as well as finance. This was a breach of Facebook's policy and standards, as well as what some might consider an ethical issue, given that a whistleblower by the name of Christopher Wiley and a few of his colleagues came forward and revealed to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I quote, Cambridge Analytica sought to identify mental and emotional characteristics in certain subsets of the American population and worked to exploit them by designing them to activate some of the worst vulnerabilities in people, such as neuroticism, paranoia, and racial bias. Yes, they gave you a Facebook survey to try and trigger neuroticism and paranoia. If they only knew that you didn't have to work that hard for racial biases on Facebook, they may not have had that much of an issue. So this obviously got a lot of flack and rolled over poorly with people, including the 87 million people who were concerned about their use of information. Facebook responded by starting to suspend around 200 different apps and app developers. As Reuters pointed out, they suspended around 200 apps in the first stage of their review that had access to large quantities of user data. They were concerned with the access that a lot of their applications were allowed. Such large access to user data, including not just contacts who you know, who you speak to, but potentially the contents of certain things, even though that goes against Facebook's policy. It is, as as Mark Zuckerberg, it's a very easy mistake to make when you look at them face on. Pointed out to the Senate committee, it is technically possible, though it is a breach of their policy. So they are currently launching an investigation at the Senate's insistence to try and limit a large number of apps and app developers. So this is blowing back on a large number of small companies, a large number of individuals, a large number of large companies. Cambridge Analytica, by the by, is no longer a company. They declared, or at least are filing to declare bankruptcy, even though they are claiming they did nothing unethical. They simply believe that they lost face and are trying to duck out of further issue. So Facebook decided to launch their own internal investigation to try and cap unethical use of user data. And Zuckerberg said that the network will investigate all apps that had access to large amounts of information before the company curtailed the data access in 2014. This goes, obviously, quite a ways back, which you'd think would actually be a good marker for the company. We're going to start taking responsibility. Who can complain about that? Well, their stockholders can complain about that. They actually dropped significantly during the period, the lull period, as I will tend to mark it. It was March 21st that Zuckerberg decided that he was going to start an internal investigation. And that's when you saw stock prices plummet, which slowly recovered over the course of the year as they got into less and less political trouble. But it's not just Facebook that's having large issues with whether or not their activity is ethical. It's not illegitimate at all because, as something's pointed out, it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not something is potentially illegal or breaking. Google recently came under fire because they took on a new contract. They took on a contract with the Department of Defense. Billed as a way of maintaining advantages over increasingly capable adversaries, the project is formally known as the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team. Its objective is to turn the enormous volume of data available to the DoD into actionable intelligence and insights at speed for human analysts. Basically, this is using facial recognition software and other forms of recognition software to try and identify threats, identify enemies in real time faster than, say, a human operator could do so. This is primarily in concern with use of drones, another hot button topic. More than 3,000 Google staffers signed a petition in April in protest at the company's focus on warfare, and I quote, "We believe that Google should not be in the business of war. Therefore, we ask that Project Maven," which is the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team's codename, "be canceled and that Google draft, publicize, and enforce a clear policy stating that neither Google nor its contractors will ever build warfare technology." The concern was, could this also lead to automated killing, murder without trial, and killing with algorithms? Because when you start to have computers figure out whether or not you should be blowing somebody up, that could potentially turn into a problem, right? Well, no, that's not going to ever go into... No, it's the ICRAC, which is the International Committee for Robotic Arms Control, also the best company name ever, warned this week that the project could potentially be mixed with general user data, non-targets, and exploited to aid targeted killing. Currently, its letter has nearly 500 signatures. And I quote, "The private data collected by Google comes with a responsibility not only to use that data to improve its own technologies and expand its business, but also to benefit society. The company's motto, 'Don't be evil,' famously embraces this responsibility. We are also deeply concerned about the possible integration of Google's data on people's everyday lives with military surveillance data," because protesters aren't going to be concerned about this at all. And its combined application of targeted killing. Google has moved into military work without subjecting itself to public debate or deliberation, which is the primary issue. Google is a technology company that primarily deals with public users, with domestic users, with civilian users have any right to just jump into the military and start applying the same technology towards targeted killing, especially with the company motto like, "Don't be evil." How do you really reconcile that? Is this an ethical move? Is this a project that, while legal, is correct? Is this something Google should have done? The problem being that, obviously, with facial recognition software, there are ways this can be useful to users. There are also ways that can be manipulated. There are ways that can be used in a completely legal setting that is questionable. And that's where we're starting to have a problem with applying ethics as a standard across the entirety of the tech industry. And here's why we shouldn't be gathering necessarily quite as much data. Politicians don't tend to understand the reach of political data gathering and whether or not it is an ethical issue. And so you can't rely on just legal terms to set these standards. Senator Cruz asked witnesses to detail how the Obama campaign used Facebook data in 2008 and 2012, suggesting that Facebook gave preferential access to those seeking to elect Democrats. This was during discussions about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So trying to turn it into a politicized statement as opposed to whether or not this was a tech issue that could have affected people was actually just a question devolved to, well, don't we have a right to it because politically we have access? Christopher Wiley, the whistleblower, pushed against Ted Cruz, who's saying a lot of people are concerned about, for example, the ability of big government to inhibit our liberties and choice. Big data can engineer a situation that limits our choice and our freedom, and it's not a partisan issue. Part of the issue with bringing it up to the Senate or bringing it up to any judiciary committee is they're going to look at it from a judiciary angle and a government angle, and this is not necessarily a concise way to approach this problem. As Nir Eyal, who actually literally wrote the book on how to manipulate users and utilize information, tech industry does not need to do better time to decide to do the right thing. The trouble is the same techniques that cross the line in certain cases lead to desirable results in others. For example, Snapchat's use streaks, which tally the number of consecutive days friends have shared photos, has been criticized for conditioning teens to compulsively keep coming back to the app. But the same persuasion technique is used by the language app Duolingo to help people learn a new language, stick with the program. The same variable rewards used to extract from gamblers paying electronic slot machines are also used in video games that help kids with cancer distract themselves as they receive painful treatments. Clearly, it's not the persuasion technique that's the problem, it's how the technique is used. But without a test to tell the difference between good and evil uses, it's easy to see how designers can go astray. Again, this is coming from a person who literally wrote a book on how to better manipulate users into doing things that you want them to do and how to make apps that hook people, apps that build habits among its users. Perhaps we need to look at a problem of how techniques are used and whether or not they're being used in a correct way. He had a peer who didn't necessarily see eye to eye with him on approach, but definitely agrees with him on whether or not we can say for sure something is good or something is evil. We're looking at Evan Selinger, a journalist primarily involved with technology, who wrote in a Medium article, "Mixed emotions exist because big tech companies aren't fundamentally like big tobacco companies, despite how popular the metaphor has become. Yes, tech addiction is real, but tech companies aren't pushing toxic single-use products. Sure, they've helped eviscerate privacy, amplify prejudice, exploit psychological weaknesses. He has a problem with the tech industry in general, so I'm going to skip ahead. But we haven't collectively kicked these companies to the curb because proprietary digital tools also enhance personal, social, economic, and civil well-being. And the free and open source movements haven't gotten the attention they deserve. And so despite all the benefits of technology, tech companies have scandalized away the public's trust." You see two people with wildly divergent views on whether or not the tech industry and technology is a good thing, also coming to the same conclusion that whereas there are problems, you can't have one sweeping ruling over how to fix these problems because something that could be used inappropriately in one fashion is often beneficial in another. So then we're seeing the problem of approaching ethics and technology not as is something good or evil, but how is something good or evil, and how are we going to try and fix this? I tried to dub this solutions, but it turns out solutions isn't actually a very straightforward way to think of it. It's more of a generalized approach and a general method that can be utilized by a number of different people across all fields to try and stabilize what the public is starting to be concerned of, a lack of ethics. So the challenge and approach to applying ethics starts somewhat stereotypically with education, or at least some people think. Natasha Singer wrote Natasha Singer was a journalist interviewing a man named Jeremy Weinstein, a Stanford political science professor, who said of Stanford, "They absolutely have a responsibility to play a leadership role in integrating these perspectives, but so does Carnegie Mellon, Caltech, Berkeley, and MIT. The set of institutions that are generating the next generation of leaders in technology have all got to get on this train." This was for a New York Times article where the university and education sector are actually trying to take responsibility for tech development and use. If you are starting to train people to use these broad-scape tools, you also want to have a system of ethics in place that they know how to use them. Every medical student takes an ethics course. Every engineer takes an ethics course. But there isn't actually an ethics course for how we should be utilizing technology, at least not yet. Stanford and MIT are both integrating them as of this year, I believe. But it hasn't exactly reached a standard yet. As Sean Knight wrote, the goal here is to train the next generation of technologists and policymakers to consider the ramifications of innovations before they hit the market, rather than be concerned with being the first to market and ask for forgiveness later. a postdoctoral fellow named Lauren Norn said, we need to at least teach people that there's a dark side to the idea you should move fast and break things. You can patch the software, but you can't patch a person if you damage someone's reputation. Again, we're starting to see people from every different followings, different fields, all involved in education and technology starting to go, we need to, as a organized front, start to take responsibility for this at the get-go. When we're teaching people how to do these things, we should also be teaching them when and whether they should be doing these things. Which is actually potentially a great tool against. As we can see here, Stack Overflow is a sort of community forum. About 50 million users get together, mostly developers and coders, to discuss solutions to problems and projects that they're working on. And every year they do a developer survey. In 2015 and 2017, we saw what doesn't necessarily look it, but are wildly divergent numbers as far as people who came from an education field as opposed to a self-taught field. Tech is very famous for having an entry where you can teach yourself these skills. In 2015, though, only about 56% of responders to this survey actually had degrees. We saw 18.4% with master's degrees in computer sciences, and only about 37% with a Bachelor of Science in some field. But in 2017, just last year, we saw 47% of people had at least a bachelor's degree and 24% went with master's. Doesn't seem like a significant increase, but when you're improving your numbers almost by half as to how many people are coming from a formalized educational background, these are people that are going to have access to those new courses that Stanford, that MIT are producing. And they are going to have this background in philosophy and ethics as to how to apply them to their field. This didn't necessarily exist before, when only half of the people in the field were actually college trained. There is also a bit of an issue with there's a prolific development of behavioral psychology as it relates to tech that is not necessarily subject to the same ethical considerations. You'd think, if you're going to apply philosophy, then there should be an ethical standard for this, but actually that's not necessarily the case. There are a slew of books written on how to better manipulate users into doing what you want them to do as far as app use and app development. There's a book called Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein. Nudge deals primarily with concept of libertarian paternalism, libertarian being people should be free to do what they like, and paternalism being that if you have the ability to try and architect and influence people's behavior to make them better, then you can and should. So people can do as they like, and you have the ability to manipulate that if you have the ability, if you have the access to it, if you have the agency. There's a book called Persuasive Technology, written by Frog. Frog was the father of captology. Captology is a study in using persuasive computer software to try and change behaviors or attitudes in the people using them. No ethical consideration there. Even I've quoted Isle before in this, and Isle wrote a book called Hooked, which is entirely about how to build habit-forming techniques with your applications, with your data, with your computers, so that people want to come back and continue to use them. And still, we have Isle starting to reconsider his views. He defended his use of technique, or at least he defended the development of his techniques, but also went back and started to look at the ethical implication and whether or not we should be doing them in all contexts. He wrote in an article for his own website that just as companies test potential features they're considering rolling out, they could test whether a questionable tactic is something people would respond favorably to if they knew what was going to happen next. Again, the author of Habit Forming thinks that we should ask people whether or not their habits should be influenced and changed in real time. Like many people, I've uninstalled distracting apps like Facebook from my phone because I regret having wasted time scrolling through my feed instead of being fully present with the people I care about. Wouldn't it be in Facebook's interest to know about people like me? If any company, be it Facebook or another business, doesn't listen to users who increasingly resent it for one reason or another, it risks more people ditching its service altogether. And that's exactly why understanding regret is so important. Ignoring people who regret using your product is not only bad ethics, it's also bad for business. as a person who developed habit-forming technology, this is also a person who went on later in his talk to discuss how he's put electronic timers on a number of things in his house, including his own internet access, so that he does not have the ability to habitually use technology. So we're starting to see a divergence from the traditional thought process. I'm going to break off and finalize this with the concept of responsibility as it's been applied at different sections of the aisle, and whether or not developing of technology is just an ethical issue. Woodrow Hartzog, who's a author and a journalist, wrote in a book of his called Privacy Blueprint, The Battle to Control the Design of New Technologies. Design isn't just an ethical issue because it is everywhere and it is power, he told me. Design is a major ethical issue because that power can and always is used for political ends. By definition, it allocates power between platforms and users, and it is never neutral. Every decision to make something searchable, to include certain things in a drop-down menu, to include a padlock icon to give the sense of safety, to nudge people for permission for certain data practices, furthers an agenda to make certain realities of disclosure come true. This is, if you are going to make a menu and only include 6 options, you are inherently only giving an user 6 options and therefore manipulating their ability to choose. And this, whereas it doesn't sound necessarily like a big deal, is a big is something that must be considered. How are people using your technology? How are they influenced to use your technology? And in something so simple as a drop-down menu, are you doing something that down the line could be habit forming, could be an issue? I'm going to finish off with one of the most virulent things to hit the internet lately. Andrew Bosworth of Facebook wrote a memo inside the company called The Ugly. It was meant to be a rallying cry, and it has actually become very much a central focus on this exact topic of ethics. He said in the memo, again, as a rallying cry, we connect people. That can be good if they make it a positive. Maybe someone finds love. Maybe it even saves the life of someone on the brink of suicide. So we connect more people. That can be bad if they make it a negative. Maybe it costs a life by exposing someone to bullies. Maybe someone dies in a terrorist attack coordinated on our tools. And still, we connect people. The ugly truth is that we believe in connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect more people more often is de facto good. And this is the dangerous concept that has been the standard for so many in the high-tech industry, but is becoming a focal point of questioning, is there a de facto good for your product? Is there a way that your product could be designed better, more safely for users? And just because you get somebody to use, or you get more people to use a product that may improve their life, is it, when balanced against the potential bad, still a de facto good? This is the ethical consideration that needs to be taken by everybody, from people who use products and consumers to people who develop and design products, not just Facebook. Anybody that makes anything based on tech that can influence people's lives, whether it be smart home application or the next Snapchat, have to consider whether or not what they are doing ultimately leads to a good. And this is the question we are going to, as a community, have to ask ourselves and ask of each other moving forward. Thank you.